Hello and welcome back to Pathfinder. My name is Philip, and I'm here to talk about Pathfinder 2nd Edition. Today's video is part 3 in my series covering the kingdom building rules for the Pathfinder Kingmaker Adventure Path. Though these rules were originally developed for Kingmaker, you can actually use them outside of that AP. Kingdom building works just as well in any other setting outside of the Stolen Lands. Feel free to use them wherever you want. As you can probably tell, this is an unscripted series. If this is somehow your first of these that you're watching, this isn't scripted. I'm just running off a slideshow. Also, please don't watch this as the first one in the series. Watching these out of order is not going to make any sense at all. But today, in part 3, we are finally getting to what kingdom management actually looks like as you're playing through it. Parts 1 and 2 were laying a lot of groundwork for terminology that we're going to be using, what a kingdom kind of looks like on its character sheet, some of the abilities that it has. But in terms of what you actually do kingdom turn to kingdom turn, that's going to start here. So part 3 is the kingdom turn. Part 4 is going to be what you do within settlements. So like building the cities that make up the kingdom. And then part 5, when I'm finally done with it, will be warfare. We're finally getting into, we're past the foundation. We're actually going to start building this house a little bit. So that's what this is. It's part 3. Again, if you haven't watched 1 and 2, this isn't going to make a lot of sense. I am getting a ton of support on this from Vance and Kerenshara's rule system. I'm referencing their rules directly, and I'm actually getting direct support from Kerenshara as I go through this. So I'm talking to him. I'm running my slides by him for review. He's actually watching my videos and providing a little bit of feedback before anybody else sees them. So that is actually where the corrections and clarifications are coming from. He mentioned a couple oddball things that I definitely need to cover in a little more detail. One of which was way back in part 1, I was talking about the leadership bonus. Nothing I said was necessarily wrong, but there was another part of it that I didn't get to yet. And that kind of ties into the action economy that exists within kingdom building. We'll get to that part here, but when I talk about leadership bonuses, don't automatically tune out because you watched part 1. You are going to want to pay pretty close attention to that because there's a specific tie-in between what leadership role you're playing, what your specialized skills are, and how many actions you can take on a given turn. So that part's pretty important. The other part that I want to clarify, and this was direct feedback from Kerenshara himself, was I kind of unintentionally underplayed how important skill training, the feat, is that gives you trained proficiency in another kingdom skill. I kind of fumbled my words a little bit. I had said you become trained in most of the skills. Technically, most is true, but that kind of paints a picture of like, you'll be trained in every skill you need. That is not true. You become trained in 10 skills at Kingdom Creation, 2 from your charter, which are typically pre-selected, or one of which is at least pre-selected, 2 from your homeland, and 2 from your government. You then get 4 other ones for free. That gives you a total of 10. There are 16 kingdom skills, so you have 6 that are untrained. Obviously, that's a bit of a gap. Now, on player characters, having a big gap like that in your skills is fine because you have other party members. The kingdom doesn't have that benefit. You really need to cover a lot of ground with just the kingdom by itself. So when you think about skill training, you're going to take it as a feat several times. When you are thinking about taking it, you should probably think, okay, what skills do I absolutely need early on? Certain skills aren't going to come in until I don't want to say late in the game, but later in the game. Warfare. You do not need warfare at the very earliest kingdom turns. You can wait until you're like kingdom level 4 before you need to start worrying about it. Honestly, probably a little bit higher than that. You could get away with delaying putting skill training into warfare. Scholarship, similarly, can wait. It's probably the least powerful skill in the game. That's not to say it's not important. It has a couple benefits that we'll kind of talk about later in this video, but it's definitely one of the least important. And then depending on how your kingdom is working, you can probably afford to live without boosting exploration, politics, or wilderness up to trained. It's going to make certain activities harder, but you can build your kingdom in such a way that these are slightly less important and you can like minimize the amount of risk to them. You can also cover for some of those with some activities I'm going to talk about later. I'm going to get into I'm going to describe a most important kingdom activity. That activity and ones like it can help cover for untrained skills. But thinking about on the other side of the spectrum, what skills do you absolutely want to be trained in? If you have a decent culture score, you absolutely want to make sure you're trained in magic, and you will probably want to make sure your magic is pumped as high as it can get. So trained, expert, master, or legendary as quickly as possible, or very soon thereafter. We'll get into why near the end of this video. Industry is also very important, as are trade and engineering. If you cover those four, for sure, you'll probably be in an okay place. But these are ones that you really need to make sure you get trained in. Realistically, you're probably going to end up taking skill training at least 3 times just to get you from 10 to 13 trained skills. Using skill increases that you naturally get to get things up to trained is going to get pretty costly, because you're going to want to make sure that those more important skills, magic, industry, trade, and engineering, get up to expert and then master, and then okay, maybe not legendary. We'll talk about that in a second. You want to get up to expert and master as quickly as possible in those ones that you're rolling really frequently, because you're going to get penalized, and those skill increases are really valuable to get you there. Legendary proficiency is usually not worth it. There are exceptions. If you build your kingdom in such a way that you really make use of a particular skill, crank it to legendary. It's fine. Magic is the exception to this. Assuming you have decent culture, get your magic to max at all times. It is probably the best skill in the game for 2 specific activities that we're going to get to. All right. That's the corrections and clarifications. These came directly from Kerenshara, as well as me kind of going through what I had said and thinking, I can say that a little bit better. So, all right, the meat of this episode. What is the kingdom turn? All right, the kingdom turn is when decisions are made to manage the kingdom and to perform kingdom activities. Players have things like combat mode, where you have, individual player turns. You have exploration mode, where the turn structure is a little more fluid. And then you have role play mode, which kind of depending on how you're doing it can be fluid or turn based, depending on subsystems, et cetera, et cetera. Kingdom turn is how the kingdom takes actions throughout time within the game. A kingdom turn takes, a kingdom turn, there can be one every month. That doesn't mean the kingdom turn takes a whole month to occur. Typically, the actions that the PCs need to undertake within a kingdom turn last about a week. Officially, that week happens at the end of the month. However, the Stolen Lands are a very big place, and especially if the PCs don't have access to, or regular access to, teleportation magic, or if they just want to do exploring as the game kind of expects you to do, it is not physically possible for the characters to move across all the way across the Stolen Lands and then all the way back in the 3 weeks between kingdom turns. And then they miss a kingdom turn, and that's a huge problem. They start incurring penalties. What Vance and Kerenshara have proposed is, and I fully agree with them on this, they talked me through it. It makes a lot of sense. You have one kingdom turn at the end of one month, and then the very next kingdom turn at the beginning of the next month. And then you can have 6 weeks and then do another end to beginning cycle. 6 weeks of travel is, in most cases, more than enough. There are certainly going to be some edge cases. Kingmaker itself is going to throw some stuff at your players, but for the most part, I think that makes a lot of sense, and I kind of like it better. But generally speaking, 1 week per month. That's what a kingdom turn takes in terms of player commitment and overall amount of time that a kingdom turn takes on the calendar. Remember, your players have to spend that week doing, or the player characters, have to spend 1 week doing the kingdom activities, or they start incurring those leadership penalties that we had talked about. Basically, the kingdom is leaderless and can't undertake certain activities without leaders. So, okay, we know what a kingdom, how long a kingdom turn takes, but what is a kingdom turn? How does it actually function? So, kingdom turns have phases, which internally have steps within them. If you're at all familiar with kind of the Magic the Gathering turn order, with like an upkeep phase, et cetera, it's a lot like that. So you not nearly as complicated. You have an upkeep phase, an activity phase, a construction phase. That one's new from V&K. We'll talk about it. And then the event phase. Generally speaking, upkeep just means get all the resources in place for the kingdom turn. Activity is when you do all the stuff you want to do. Construction is a very small phase where you can kind of finish projects that you started earlier. And then the event phase is when external things happen to the kingdom. These phases do have to be taken in this order. So this is not something that you can shift around. You have to take them in that order. So the upkeep phase. This sets the resources and constraints for the next kingdom turn. It has 4 steps. The assigning of leadership roles, the adjustment of unrest, the collection of resources, and the payment of consumption. It's pretty straightforward. For step 1, the assigning of leadership roles, if new leadership roles are desired, you have to take the new leadership activity. We'll talk about kingdom activities later. That is just an activity. You roll a check. You can put new leaders in new positions. There's no limit to the number of times that this can be performed. However, it can run risks if you fail your check. So there's a reason you wouldn't do it a lot unless you have a good reason to do so. If in this step, you also determine if there are any vacancy penalties. If the role just completely hasn't been filled, then the vacancy penalty applies. You just take the vacancy penalty. I talked about the vacancy penalty a little bit in part 1. I described what each one was. They're all pretty bad. The ruler is the one you definitely don't want to get, but so always make sure your leadership roles are filled, and really always make sure that the ruler position is filled. If an NPC hasn't spent the amount of time necessary to perform their duties, the penalties are applied automatically. If a PC hasn't spent the time necessary to perform their duties, they can either incur that penalty, or they can give up one of the kingdom activities that PC can normally do on that turn. We'll talk about that in a minute. All right, step 2, basically for step 1. You don't have to worry about this if all your roles have been filled and if everybody has been spending the 1 week of downtime. That's the summary thought. If you have NPCs and PCs in all 8 of the kingdom leadership roles, and then if all those characters were able to spend the amount of time necessary, then this step 1 of the upkeep phase, nothing happens. You don't have to worry about it. It only comes up if a PC or NPC dies, if they leave that position, or if they weren't able to spend the time necessary. All right. Step 2, adjust unrest. That is this something always happens on this step. On turn 1, so your very first kingdom turn, your kingdom unrest is set to 0. It doesn't go up in this phase. On all other turns, unrest naturally increases by 1. This just happens every turn. Okay. Let me back up. On all other turns, unrest increases by 1 for any of the following conditions. That's how I should phrase that. So if a settlement in the kingdom is overcrowded, then your unrest increases by 1. We'll get into what overcrowded means in part 4, but if a settlement is overcrowded, you increase your unrest by 1, and that stacks for every settlement. So if you have 2 overcrowded settlements, it increases by 2. If you're at war, we will talk about what at war officially means in part 5, but if you're at war, unrest goes up by 1. If there's an ongoing kingdom event that says unrest goes up, well, guess what? Your unrest goes up. And then finally, if there is a secondary territory, recall at the end of part 2, I talked about what happens if your kingdom is stretched kind of thin and you lose a territory and you have like a primary territory that has the capital and then a separated secondary territory that is not contiguous over land. If there is a secondary territory, unrest increases by 1. Those are the 4 scenarios where unrest goes up. You always need to check for those. If unrest is 10 or higher, then you roll a d10 and you distribute that number among all your ruin scores. Now you the players are allowed to distribute that number however you want. On top of that, you roll a DC 11 flat check. If you fail that check, you lose a hex in your kingdom, and your kingdom size decreases by 1. The PCs choose which hex to lose. So you can't roll it and then the GM can go ha 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 and create a secondary territory. They can't do that. The PCs get to pick which one. But these two are pretty bad. If unrest ever climbs to 20 or higher, then the nation falls into anarchy. Now, anarchy is a special state that you really don't want to be in, because the only activity that you can perform when the kingdom is in anarchy is quell unrest. That is the only thing that anybody in any of the PC leaders or NPC leaders can do is quell unrest. And all the checks, any check that the kingdom makes, which applies to quell unrest, has their degree of success decreased by 1. So you literally cannot critically succeed. You can only succeed at checks. And you are more likely to not only fail, but critically fail when you are in anarchy. So that's really bad. Keep your unrest below 20 for sure, and 10 whenever possible, because these penalties hurt quite a bit. All right, that was step 2. Step 3 is resource collection. First question is, how many resource dice do I roll? We talked about this a little bit before, but just as a reminder, the number of resource dice you roll is equal to your kingdom level plus 4, plus any settlement dice that you have. We'll talk about those in part 4. Plus any bonus dice that you get, minus any penalty dice that you get. Overall, kingdom level plus 4 is going to be most common. Once your settlements get fairly strong, you might throw in some settlement dice. And then bonuses and penalties it's very clear when you get them. So this is not a super challenging question to answer. It's fairly easy to calculate the number of dice. Once you know the number of dice, you just double check how big those resource dice are. And this goes up with kingdom size. So as your kingdom size goes up, I accidentally wrote kingdom die size increases with kingdom level. That's not true. Die size increases with kingdom size. So as your kingdom size is 1 through 9, you roll a d4. If it goes to 10 to 24, it becomes a d6. 25 to 49 hexes becomes a d8. 50 to 99 hexes becomes a d10. And 100 hexes or greater, it becomes a d12. Once you know the number of dice and the size of the dice you're rolling, you just roll the total number of resource dice, add up the numbers, and that is your total number of resource points, RP, for that kingdom turn. You can write those in the upper part of your kingdom sheet. I don't have the specific RP thing highlighted here, but it's right between kingdom size and kingdom XP. Pretty straightforward. After you collect your resource points, you then collect your commodities. So most work sites, not all of them, passively generate commodities. Lumber camps generate lumber, mines generate ore, and quarries passively generate stone. This is passive generation. You don't have to do anything to get this. That number just goes up. The number in your commodities thing just goes up until it hits the max value underneath each commodity every time the kingdom turn rolls over. Now, how many commodities does each work site generate? In standard hexes, so hexes that don't have a resource designation on them, then a work site generates 1 commodity. However, we talked in the last video about hexes that have resource traits. So it might have like a resource brackets lumber trait. If you build a lumber camp on a lumber hex, you generate 2 commodities of that commodity type. Now you'll notice here that I didn't talk about farmlands. Farmlands do not passively generate food. We'll talk about that a few points here. It's very easy to forget that. I got it wrong the first time I made these slides, and Kerenshara had to correct me because it is not intuitive. Farmlands are the one that don't do that. We'll talk about that in a bit. Yeah, if you ever generate commodities in excess of the kingdom's maximum, so lower right, you see like food, lumber, luxuries, ore, and stone. There's a max value under that. If the number you generate or bank ever exceeds that max, they're just lost. You can't do anything with those. They just disappear. All right, finally, you've done all your first 3 steps. Now step 4, pay your consumption. How do you calculate the total kingdom consumption? Remember, consumption is just the basic amount of food that the kingdom consumes in order to survive. Total kingdom consumption equals settlement consumption total. Every settlement will have its own consumption value. We'll get to that in part 4. Plus the army consumption total. So the sum of the consumption value of each army. We'll talk about those in part 5. Minus the number of farmland hexes under the influence of settlements. So it's not just farmland hexes that you have. They have to be under the influence of a settlement. We talked about influence in the last episode. So minus the number of farmland hexes influenced by settlements, plus any modifiers from active kingdom events. Technically, I think there are kingdom events that might drive your consumption up or down, so it could be plus or minus modifiers from kingdom events, but most of the time it means your consumption is going to go higher. So total kingdom consumption equals settlement consumption plus army consumption minus farmland hexes influenced by settlements plus or minus any modifiers from kingdom events. This is where the farmland is kind of passively generating quote unquote food. It's just that food isn't the food commodity. It's offsetting consumption. So that's the difference. Your minimum consumption is always 0. It can never be negative. So how do we pay for consumption? If you have consumption that, okay, well, hang on. Okay, in some cases, if you're lucky, if your kingdom is well designed, your farmland hexes will just naturally offset any consumption from your settlements, your armies, and any modifiers. But what happens if that's not the case? What if we have a consumption total that is positive? How do we pay for it? Well, the first thing you can do is you can spend food commodities. We'll talk about how you get those in a minute, but well, in a few minutes. It's a little later on. But you can have food that you can then just pay to offset a certain amount of consumption. Pretty straightforward. If you don't have enough food, or this is an option, you can choose not to spend it if you need it for something else. You can spend 5 resource points, 5 RP per consumption point. It's a little steep, but it is possible. Alternatively, you can just increase unrest by 1d4. This bumps you back to the adjust unrest step. That doesn't mean you do steps 3 and 4. Again, you just increase your unrest. Pretty straightforward. So let's say your consumption total that we talked about earlier is positive. You spend food. If you don't do that, you pay 5 resource points per positive consumption remaining, or you just increase unrest by 1d4. That's what happens. All right, that is the whole upkeep phase. So there's a lot going on there, but it's extremely methodical. After you do it the first 2 times, it's pretty easy to remember. The activity phase is, okay, it's easier in concept because there are only 2 steps. The problem is the variety that those steps can take is huge, because those steps are, well, okay, let's back up a second. What do you do in the activity phase? This is when you do the stuff. This is when you, as the leaders, say, I want my kingdom to build a structure or quell unrest, or I want my kingdom to send out diplomatic envoys. There are dozens of potential kingdom activities that you can undertake, and this is the turn, or this is the phase of the kingdom turn in which you do them. It has 2 steps. Kingdom activities, where the activities of the overall kingdom happen, and then army activities, where the activities associated with armies and warfare happen. We're not going to cover the army activities, or basically any of step 2. That is wartime only. You only ever do that during the warfare part of the game. Warfare is its own video at the end of this series, so we'll get to that later. But step 1, the kingdom activities. These are undertaken by the leaders. Player character leaders, so PCs, have 3 actions per kingdom turn. This is your 3-action economy. This is as close as this subversion of the game gets to having Pathfinder 2e's famous 3-action economy. PC leaders have 3 actions per kingdom turn. NPC leaders have 2. So PCs naturally have an advantage. So this is why it's really valuable to have all the PCs in leadership roles. It's one of the reasons. NPC leaders only have 2 actions, and a leader cannot attempt the same action more than once. There are certain activities that will openly state within their rules that this does not apply. It's just the specific versus general rule. Specific text overrides general rules in all cases. So, there are 3 categories of kingdom activities. There are region activities, which are geographic in nature. There are civic activities, which are settlement adjacent. And then there are leadership activities, which is just the catch-all phrase for everything else. So what is a region activity? A region activity is any activity with the region trait. These occur within specific hexes. A region trait will be any action, or the region activity, will be an action that says you're going to do this action, but you have to pick a spot where it's going to be. You just pick the hex. There is a limit on these. You can only perform a region activity once per turn per hex. So no hex can have more than 1 region activity in it in a given turn. And at the same time, the same action can only be taken twice in a kingdom turn in different hexes. So if what's a good example? If I take activity A in the hex over in the east, and then if I take activity A again in a hex over in the west, I cannot take activity A in a hex in the middle. I've already done it twice. All right, region traits, there's a special rule for those. We've talked about bonuses that come from, or that apply to kingdom skill checks. Item bonuses in kingdom management come from structures. Structures are typically located in settlements, and item bonuses from structures can only apply to a region activity if the hex in which the action is occurring is under the influence of a settlement which contains the structure in question. So you have to be near the structure providing the bonus in order to get the bonus. All right, next one is civic activities. These all have the civic trait. These occur not within specific hexes, but within specific settlements. There's a limit to these. You can only undertake 1 civic activity per turn per settlement. But there's the only limit to the number of civic activities you can undertake is the number of settlements. If you have 5 settlements, you can take 5 civic activities, but each one has to be in a different settlement. Some structures can grant settlements additional actions to undertake civic activities. This is great. We're going to talk about these in part 4, but you can build structures that help settlements have better. You can think of it as administrative capacity. Essentially, the capacity, or not the capacity, the administration capabilities of the settlement grant them their own turns that can be used to undertake activities in those settlements. The leaders don't need to spend an action to perform those activities, but the leader must be designated as the one who rolls the check. The GM might allow for the appointment of a mayor or another NPC. That's not really written into the rules, but you could say, yeah, this is the NPC who's acting as the quote unquote leader for this settlement. I think it's a really fun idea, but it does run the risk of having a mayor who has a really low leadership bonus. And then, good idea. Talk to your GM if you like it. Figure out how the execution works a little bit. All right. And then we have leadership activities. These have the leadership trait. This is just the catch-all for any activity which is not region or civic. So it doesn't occur in a specific hex and it doesn't occur in a specific settlement. It's a leadership activity. There are some traits which apply to leadership activities beyond just the leadership trait. One is the commerce trait. Commerce trait activities can only be attempted once each per turn. So you can perform as many commerce activities as you want, as long as you never perform the same one more than once. Additionally, each leadership activity must occur from a home-based settlement chosen by the leader who's undertaking the activity. leaders can choose any settlement they like and don't need to spend time moving between those settlements. So your leader doesn't need to physically go to a place and spend time doing that. They can just say, I'm administering this activity through this settlement way over there. They could just say that. That settlement is the settlement whose item bonuses are the ones which apply to the check. Again, you pick a settlement, that's the one whose item bonuses you get. The only difference is you don't have to physically be there in order to do this. You don't have to, your leader character doesn't have to be in close proximity to the village. All right, the kingdom, we get back to the question of, okay, great, we kind of understand how these actions and activities work, kind of, but how do we actually do it? So the kingdom spends leadership actions and settlement actions, if you have any, to attempt kingdom activities until all those actions run out or the players choose to stop. There are reasons why you might choose to stop. You might be out of resource points. You might just not have anything you want to or can do. Generally, good idea to burn through, as many resources as you can. But there are situations where you wouldn't want to. There's no required order to how these actions need to be spent. So I gave an example here. Player character 1 can take an activity, then NPC 1, then NPC 2, then PC 2, then PC 1, etc., etc. You could also do it with an NPC first. NPC 1, PC 1, PC 2, NPC 1 can go again. NPC 2 can go for the first time. You can even have a settlement go first. Settlement 1 can go, and then PC 1 can go, and then NPC 1 can go, etc., etc. The point is, there's not a correct order in which to do this. I already talked about this a little bit, but each leader has a number of actions. PC leaders get 3 actions. This is the 3-action economy. And NPC leaders get 2 actions. Leaders choose to perform the activities, or the kingdom activities, and each activity takes at least 1 action. It can take more than 1. And that's because of specialized skills. You remember when I talked about back in part 1, every leader has, every leadership role, has specialized skills that leadership role is particularly good at doing. Not only does that affect their leadership bonus, which I'll talk about in a minute, but activities using a leader specialized skill use 1 action. However, if that leader undertakes a kingdom activity that is not using their specialized skill, those activities require 2 actions. Also, every kingdom activity generally requires a skill check. The leader who initiates the activity is the one who rolls the check, and they are the one whose leadership bonus applies. Remember, leaders only apply their full leadership bonus to specialized skills, activities that use their specialized skills. On activities that don't, they only apply half their leadership bonus. So let's say I am the ruler and hang on, did I put the chart in here? Yes, I did. Okay. I am the ruler and I am going to undertake a kingdom activity that forces me to make an industry roll. Not only does that only take 1 of my 3 actions, I get to add my full leadership bonus to that roll. Good. All right, instead, I'm playing the counselor, and I now want to undertake an industry or a kingdom activity that forces me to take an industry check. The counselor does not have industry as one of their specialized skills. So taking this kingdom activity forces them to spend 2 actions instead of 1. Additionally, they only get to add half their leadership bonus, rounded down, to this check. All right. Here's the table of specialized skills by leader. Feel free to pause the video. It's also in a chart at the back of VNK's rules PDF, which is linked in this video, or in the description of the video. All right, I threw a lot at you for step 1, but the good news is step 2 is army activities. We're not talking about that until warfare. So we'll get to that in the warfare step. Functionally, it's very similar, but you do other stuff. That is the activity phase. That is the bulk of what the PCs are going to be doing. or players, not just the PCs. The players are going to be identifying kingdom activities, and then rolling checks to make those activities happen. The limits on what activities they can do are based on how many actions they have and how many resource points they have to spend. You do checks until you run out of either actions or resources, and then you end that activity phase. Fairly straightforward once you understand how the constraints work. The construction phase is new. This, very basically, the construction phase is a sort of mini phase built into the turn in which large-scale, multi-turn building projects can continue to be built. This is brand new. It was introduced by Vance and Kerenshara. We'll talk about it when we get to the build, structure, and accelerate project activities later in the video, but very basically, structures within settlements, when you build them, take a certain amount of resources to construct. Makes sense. If you don't have everything available right at the beginning, specifically the resource points, if you don't have every resource point available, you can build a certain amount and then on later turns continue dedicating resource points to this to the building of this structure in order to complete it. There's also another reason why you wouldn't be able to build a structure within a single kingdom turn, and that is the limit on how much you can build within a kingdom turn. We'll get to that later, but essentially, Vance and Kerenshara noticed that it takes the same amount of time to build a house as it does to build a castle, and they said, well, hang on, that doesn't make sense. So they introduced a limit that says you can only spend X amount of RP to construct structures in a given turn. Makes sense. I think that's entirely reasonable. The construction phase is the offset to that, which is, we need a new phase to say when ongoing construction happens. That happens right here. All right. Then we get to the final phase of the kingdom turn, the event phase. This is when the outside world starts to impact the kingdom. It has 4 steps. 1, check for a random event. 2, resolve any events that are ongoing. Step 3, apply any kingdom experience. And then step 4, increase the kingdom level if you have enough experience points to do so. Step 1 is pretty straightforward. You check for a random event. To do this, you attempt a DC 16 flat check. If you succeed, a kingdom event occurs. Congratulations. However, if you fail or critically fail, the DC of the next event flat check is reduced by 5, meaning it's more likely that you'll have to do a kingdom phase or a kingdom event next time. Additionally, the DC resets to 16 once an event occurs. So I pass my DC 16 flat check. Great. The next time it's a DC 11. I pass that. Okay. Now it's a DC 6. I fail that one. I have a kingdom event. The next time I roll it, it's reset to DC 16 again. But what are kingdom events? Kingdom events are challenges imposed upon a kingdom which generally require a skill check or multiple skill checks to resolve. There are several traits which can apply to them. The beneficial trait is for events which represent opportunities for the kingdom. These are typically good things or things that have the potential to be good if your kingdom responds to them well. The dangerous trait, pretty obviously, are any events which are functionally threats to the kingdom. And then the continuous trait applies to any events which are spread out over multiple event phases on multiple kingdom turns. So you might get an event which says this takes place over the next 3 kingdom turns, and that type of event would have the continuous trait. Notably, these traits can overlap. There can be continuous dangerous events and continuous beneficial events as well. A few other ones. The hex trait applies to events which occur within a specific kingdom hex, and then the settlement trait occurs within a specific settlement. Beyond these traits, kingdom events will have certain other features. They will have an event name. One of them is, I think, Bandit's Attack. Another one might be Famine. And then they will have a modifier. This is the level of the event. The DC. So normally you have like your control DC for the checks you roll in order to determine, yeah, my kingdom activity succeeded. Well, kingdom events are a little bit different. The DC of the event is equal to the control DC plus that event's event modifier, effectively its level. So kingdom events are actually the harder checks that you will be rolling against. Certain events will have locations associated with them. This will tell you where the event takes place relative to the kingdom. And then the event will have a very broad description. How it can impact the players, what it does, typically what kind of checks you need to roll. Most of this is GM facing. The players don't typically get like a card that says, here's the event. The GM will see most of this stuff and then present it to the players. Finally, the event will list the kingdom skill. Which skill check or checks can be rolled to impact the event? And then there will be there can be special modifiers that apply to certain checks. There's a leader feature. If a particular PC occupies a listed leadership role, then a circumstance bonus is applied to the event skill check. So if you have a PC occupying the ruler leadership role and the and the event lists the ruler leadership position, then guess what? You get to add a circumstance bonus to your rolls. +1 at level 1, +2 at level 9, and +3 at levels 15 or above. Pretty straightforward. There are outcomes listed. These are just your degrees of success based on your check. There's a resolution entry, which would list how to resolve any continuous events which occur over time. And then there's a special section. This is just miscellaneous special conditions which alter the event. Again, these are largely GM facing. They're fairly self-explanatory. The GM should be able to kind of figure it out and explain it to the players. I just want to make sure everybody going into this has a basic understanding of how the events work. All right, step 2, event resolution. How do we resolve a kingdom event? Well, you roll the kingdom skill check or checks for that event, and in some cases, PCs will need to enter exploration or encounter modes to resolve events. So there might be an event like a monster attacks. Well, guess what? The PCs need to go enter encounter mode and fight the monster. Yeah, these are typically the ones that are Kingmaker specific, but they don't necessarily have to be. All right, step 3, applying kingdom experience. This is one of the fun parts. The GM hands out XP from the turn. Based on my experience with how you play the rest of Pathfinder, I'm thinking players will just say, oh, I got the XP back in the upkeep phase or the activity phase. I'm just going to write it down then. Most of the time, that's perfectly fine. But technically speaking, the GM is supposed to be the one to tally the XP, and then they don't hand it out until step 3 of the event phase. But this is also when any unspent resource points you have convert into XP. We've talked about that before. I think I might talk about it again in more detail here. Maybe I don't. No. But if you have any RP that you haven't spent, you can convert it into XP. The ratio decreases as you level up, but generally speaking, it's usually better to just spend all your resource points. But again, there's reasons why you wouldn't. Generally speaking, there's 6 ways to gain experience points. We covered these in part 2. Claiming hexes, constructing structures and improving terrain, milestone XP, any awards for kingdom events, any miscellaneous awards, and then surplus resource points. Again, go see part 2 for a more detailed description of all that. Finally, we come to step 4, increase the kingdom level. When a kingdom hits 1,000 XP, the first question you have to ask is, are you at your maximum level? Maximum level is always equal to the party level, so you can't have a level 6 kingdom with level 5 PCs. That's not allowed. If you do that, you have to wait until the PCs level up, and you just keep adding kingdom XP to your total. And then when you finally get the PCs leveled up, you subtract 1,000 off the kingdom XP and level them up like normal. If you aren't at your max level, you subtract 1,000 XP from your total and you increase your level. Go back to part 2 of this series to talk about leveling up a kingdom and the benefits you get. All right, that was the whole kingdom turn. We covered upkeep, activity, construction, and event phases. Again, no one phase is particularly complicated in theory. And honestly, the execution for the upkeep and event phases are fairly straightforward. Activity phase gets a little complicated, only because of the amount of stuff you can do, but overall what you're doing is fairly simple. And then construction phase is only complicated because we haven't gotten to the activities that you do that lead you to a construction phase. That'll clear up in just a little bit here. All right. Now, we're going to spend literally the rest of the video going over every single kingdom activity in the game. You're going to know every activity that the kingdom can take, unless there are special activities that are specific to the plot of Kingmaker. I'm not saying if there are, I'm not saying if they're not, but I'm not going to cover ones that are Kingmaker specific. But other than that, we're going to cover every single one in detail. For the most part, kingdom activities can be broken into 2 groups. There are general skill activities, which can be performed with multiple skills. It will list which ones apply. And then there are specific skill activities. These are skill specific. They can only be performed with a specific listed skill. All kingdom activities fall into these 2 categories. Now we're just going to go through them. This is all it is. We're just going to go through every single one. First one. Okay, so for reference, I am mostly going to cover the SparkNotes version of the overall activity text. That's what I'm going to be discussing. But I did, for all of these, put the full text of the activity on the right side of the screen. So if at any point something I said didn't make sense, feel free to pause the video, read through it yourself. These are all pulled directly from V&K's PDF, which again is linked at in the description of this video. First one we're covering, Abandon Hex. This has the region trait, which again means it is specific to a particular hex. Abandoning a hex means willingly eliminating a hex from the kingdom. For every additional hex that you are trying to eliminate during this activity, you increase the DC of the check by 1. And the kingdom size is then adjusted based on the degree of success that you achieve. If you succeed or critically succeed, you adjust your kingdom size. Actually, if you fail too, but you adjust your kingdom size accordingly. The skills you can roll for this are exploration or wilderness. And then you just roll them against your control DC, adjusting it a little bit based on the number of hexes. If you critically succeed, the hex is abandoned, and you gain 1 resource point per hex. If you succeed, it is similar to the critical success. However, you don't gain any resource points. And yes, I did make a very silly typo there, and I'm not going to acknowledge it by reading it out loud. If you fail, you do abandon the hexes. However, you increase your unrest by 2. At the same time, you attempt a DC 6 flat check. And if you fail, you trigger the Squatter's Kingdom event. I'm not going to get into what that event is. I'm not going through every kingdom event in this series. Those are typically administered by the GM, and I don't want to kill any sense of suspense or tension by revealing every single bag or every single trick that the GM has in their bag of tricks. If you critically fail, it is the same as a failure. So you unrest increases by 2. You attempt your DC 6 flat check and risk the Squatter's Kingdom event. But the unrest is increased by 3 instead. And instead of squatters, it becomes the bandit activity. The bandit activity kingdom event. There's a special statement here. I'm just going to read it from the rules text directly, the unrest gained from abandoning a hex doubles if that hex includes a settlement. A settlement in an abandoned hex becomes a freehold. Remember, freeholds are just settlements that are not associated with a kingdom. Next activity, build structure. Okay, we're getting into a hard one right off the bat here. All right, build structure. This has the civic trait, meaning it is bound to a specific settlement. You attempt to build a structure in a settlement. This can also be used to repair a damaged structure. We'll talk a little bit about structures and like damage in part 4. Generally speaking, a structure can be damaged and you can repair it to make it fully functional again. Build structure is the activity you use to do that. It's pretty intuitive. The skill check you roll to build a structure varies by the structure type. So if it's associated with defense, you typically roll warfare. If it's associated with, say, caravans, you might roll trade. If you critically succeed, construction and repairs begin, and you recover half of the commodities that you spent to build that structure. Most structures have an associated number of commodities required to build them. If you critically succeed on your check, hey, your building was more efficient than expected and you gain half the commodities that you spent back. If you succeed, you don't gain those commodities back, but construction and repairs begin. If you fail, they don't begin. You don't start constructing or repairing the structure. However, if you reattempt on the next kingdom turn, then you don't actually spend the resource points and commodities that you would be required to spend, because those resources and commodities are assumed to be still on the work site. This is in contrast to the critical fail effect. Once again, construction and repairs do not begin. However, rubble fills the lots. There's no benefit to like building again on the next turn and reclaiming or conserving resources and commodities. No, all the resources and commodities that you spent on this are lost, and rubble now fills the lot or lots associated with this structure, because we'll get to lots in a minute, or in the next video actually. This is bad because if there's rubble, you can't build anything there until you use the clear lot activity. So don't critically fail. It's really bad. Now, there are some limitations on building structure. This is new from Vance and Kerenshara. There is a limit to the number of build structure actions you can take in a single settlement, based on the structures you have in that settlement with the civic trait. If you have no structures with the civic trait, we'll get into structure traits in part 4. Then, for instance, you can only build one, or you can only take one build structure activity. If you add a town hall, that number goes up. If you build a castle, the number goes up again. If you build a palace, it doesn't go up, but there's a benefit for why you would do a palace. This limit applies to the total number of structures built and the number of non-infrastructure structures built. This is confusing because I haven't gone over part 4 yet. But basically, you can build structures, and then some structures will be a thing called infrastructure, which is like not a new building, but an improvement on the existing settlement infrastructure. So, for instance, adding sewers. Usually you can build a building, and then you can also build an infrastructure improvement on top of being able to build a building. So this table kind of explains it. It'll make more sense when we get to part 4. Additionally, there is a different limit we have to be aware of. There's a maximum amount of resource points that you can spend on the build structure activity in a given turn. The amount you can spend increases with your resource die size. So as your resource die size, which is tied to your kingdom size, increases, you can spend more resource points on construction. The amount you can spend also increases if you build a construction yard, which is good. We like that. The amount you can spend also varies by structure type. So untyped structures, for instance, are called normal in these tables that you see on the right. Residential structures, you can usually spend more to build them. Infrastructure improvements, things like sewers, you can actually build less. And edifices, which are like the special custom buildings for a settlement, those you can also typically build less. Or I should say the limits are lower. This is a major rules change from Vance and Kerenshara. The idea here is residential buildings are typically less complicated to build than things like alchemy labs or something like that. So you can typically spend more to build them. Infrastructure improvements typically get built more slowly, as do edifice buildings, which are things like palaces and castles, which take a long time to build because they have to be done very carefully. There's a question then implied by this. What happens if I don't finish my structure? This is where we wrap back around and enter the construction phase. The kingdom can spend RP up to a limit to continue construction on any incomplete structures. There's no limit to the number of incomplete structures a kingdom can have. The RP limit on construction still applies. So I enter the construction phase. I have an incomplete structure in settlement A. That structure, I can automatically spend resource points up to the limit of my construction RP per turn to continue building that structure. Why is this useful? I don't have to re-roll the check to continue building that. My construction check that I rolled previously to get the construction started still applies here. I can just keep throwing RP at this thing on the construction phases until it's done. That's an important thing to note. Now, you might be wondering, well, hang on. Build structure takes place during the activity phase, and ongoing construction happens in the construction phase, which is after the activity phase. This is the special rule. Ongoing construction doesn't apply to structures started on this kingdom turn. You can't jump into construction phase and be like, oh, I'm going to ongoing construction, the thing I just started. You can't do that, in no small part because you've probably already spent your maximum RP for construction in that turn. Now, there are certain instances when you might want to throw extra resources at a structure, at a project, building project, and make it go faster. That is where the Accelerate Project Leadership activity comes in. This has the leadership trait. And what you're trying to do is attempt to speed up a construction project exceeding the normal RP limit for construction. So basically, you roll a check to say, I want to throw my leadership ability at this problem and make this building get built faster. What are you rolling? Well, you roll that construction check again, and the DC is equal to the base skill check for constructing the structure +2. It's harder because you're trying to make it go faster. And again, when I say you roll the construction skill check, it's whatever the skill you rolled to build the structure. Remember, the skill you roll to build a structure is dependent on what that structure is. If you critically succeed on this check, you apply up to 1.5 times the resource point limit to that selected structure. Edifice structures are still limited to the base RP limit value. So essentially, edifice structures, you can't do like 1.5 times the RP limit. You just do one time. Critically succeed, or as a success, it's as the critical success, but it's just 1 times the limit. So you get to throw an extra limit worth of RP at the structure. If you fail, nothing happens. If you critically fail, then the amount of RP which can be spent on to continuing construction is reduced by the size of your resource dice. This is really bad. Now, normally I wouldn't do this. However, Kerenshara, when he was reviewing my text, or the text on my slides, he said, all right, I need you to review in specific the text of the Accelerate Project rule, because it is very specific and it is very easy to screw up. So Kerenshara, this one is for you. I'm about to spend probably 2 minutes reading every word that you wrote. Accelerate project. Traits, downtime, and leadership. You focus additional time and resources on attempting to complete a large construction project faster than normal. Choose a structure that has been started via a successful build structure activity, but has not yet been completed. Make a check using the skill used to build the chosen structure with a DC equal to the DC needed to build that structure plus 2. Regardless of the outcome, the same structure cannot be chosen for Accelerate Project until the next Kingdom turn. Critical success. Your efforts are spectacularly effective at accelerating the speed of construction. You may immediately spend RP up to 1.5 times the size of the kingdom's up to 1.5 times the size of the kingdom's resource die and apply it toward the completion of the structure. If this RP is enough to finish construction, the structure is completed immediately, instead of during the ongoing construction step. If the structure has the edifice trait, you may only spend up to the size of the kingdom's resource die instead of 1.5. See, I'm glad I read this. I had said the wrong thing. Success. As a critical success, but you may only spend RP up to the size of the kingdom's resource die, or half the size of the kingdom's resource die if the structure has the edifice trait. Failure. You fail to effectively accelerate construction. Critical failure. Your efforts not only fail, but cause further delays. Reduce the amount of RP you spend on this structure during the next reduce the amount of RP you may spend on this structure during the continuing construction step by the size of the kingdom's resource die. Special. You may still continue building the structure during the ongoing construction step. As normal, if a structure was started with a successful build structure activity this turn, it is ineligible for ongoing construction on the same turn. So I'm kind of glad that I read that out because I said the wrong thing here. I'm going to make a slide adjustment so those of you who like to pause and read the slides will have the right one to read. Apply 1.5, it's not the RP limit, it's the resource die size. This is the type of nice, polished content that you get here at Pathfinder. And you wonder why I script my videos in advance. All right, next activity. Celebrate Holiday. This has the leadership trait. You attempt to increase morale through celebration. The skill check for this is either folklore or politics. And if you did this on your last turn, the DC of this activity increases by 4. If you critically succeed, you gain a +2 to all loyalty-based skill checks until the end of the next kingdom turn. If you succeed, you get a +1 to all loyalty-based skill checks until the end of the next kingdom turn. You also roll 1 resource die and pay the associated RP. If you can't pay, this automatically results in a critical fail. Failure. You roll 1 resource die and pay the associated RP. Critical fail. You lose 4 resource dice on the next kingdom turn, and take a -1 to loyalty-based checks until the end of the next kingdom turn. Special. There is a limit of 1 Celebrate Holiday activity per kingdom turn. Reconnoiter Hex. This has the Regent trait. You survey and explore a designated hex. The skill check associated with this is Exploration or Wilderness. The DC is equal to your control DC, plus the level of the zone in which the hex lies. The Stolen Lands map is divided into zones, each of which has a level, and then you subtract the level of the kingdom. The RP cost of this is 1, so you always have to spend 1 resource point to do this. And I had to look this up. What does reconnoiter actually mean? It means preliminary scouting to identify terrain, features, and potential threats. This is often accomplished by the PCs during exploration activities. Reconnoiter is where the word recon comes from. If you critically succeed on this activity, the hex is reconnoitered for the purposes of the claim hex activity, which we'll get to in a minute. One special or hidden feature of the hex is automatically discovered. Encounters are avoided, but are reported to the PCs. You also can attempt an additional reconnoiter hex activity at no action cost. If you succeed, the hex is reconnoitered again, and you also learn of one special or hidden feature may be discovered, which may be discovered at the GM's discretion, so they get to pick. Encounters are avoided, but are reported to the PCs. The main difference is that the GM gets to pick, and you don't get to attempt another reconnoiter hex at no cost. If you fail, the hex is not reconnoitered for the purposes of claim hex, and the encounters are avoided, but they are reported to the PCs. If you critically fail, once again, the hex is not reconnoitered. However, the team members die. The team that you sent out into the field to do this for you die. This imposes a -1 penalty on all loyalty-based checks until the end of the next kingdom turn. If there is an encounter, the team is slaughtered, and this causes unrest to increase by 1. As a special rule, no Kingdom XP is awarded for a crit success on the Reconnoiter Hex activity. So if you critically succeed at Kingdom checks, typically you can gain XP. Reconnoiter Hex, this does not apply. Clear Hex. This has the region trait. You prepare a hex for further development, to prepare a hex for a settlement, or to demolish a previously built improvement. The skill check for this is engineering. The RP cost depends on the terrain feature. If there's mountains, it costs 12 RP. If there's swamps, it costs 8. If there's forest, it's 4. If there's hills, it's 2. And if there's plains, it's 1. In order to remove a hazard or encounter, that's if you're preparing a hex for a settlement. If you are going to remove a hazard or an encounter from a hex, then you have to roll exploration. So engineering to prep it for settlements or to remove an improvement. Exploration if you're going to remove a hazard or an encounter from a hex. The DC for removing a hazard or encounter is just the highest level hazard or the encounter. And then you add a +2 to the check DC for all non-kingdom hexes. Still on the clear hex activity, if you critically succeed, the hex is automatically cleared, and you recover any resource points spent during the activity. If the creatures were cleared from the hex, you then gain 2 luxuries. Awesome. Success, the hex is just cleared. Failure, the hex is not cleared. Critical failure, the hex is not clear and the workers are injured or killed. Unrest then increases by 1. As a special rule, ruins and structures on the hex are not destroyed by this activity. These features can be incorporated into later settlements. All right, next one. Claim hex. This is attempting to incorporate a hex into the kingdom. There are some requirements associated with this. There's actually several. You first have to reconnoiter the hex that you're going to try to claim. You can do this either during exploration or with the reconnoiter hex activity. Additionally, the hex needs to have been cleared, either during adventuring or with the clear hex activity. Wouldn't you know it, those are the last 2 that I talked about. Finally, the hex must be adjacent to at least one existing kingdom hex. So you can't just go claim an island hex that's not attached to anything. This costs 1 RP, and the skill check you roll is exploration, intrigue, magic, or wilderness. If you critically succeed, the hex is added to the territory, your kingdom size increases, and you can immediately attempt any other region activity at no action cost. If you succeed, not critically succeed, just succeed, you don't get the additional action, but all the other stuff happens. Kingdom size, hex added, etc., etc. If you fail, the hex is not claimed, and if you critically fail, the hex is not claimed, and the settlers you attempted to send to that hex are lost. This imposes a -1 penalties to all stability, a -1 penalty to all stability-based checks until the end of the kingdom turn. As a special rule, there's a limit to the number of times you can attempt to claim a hex in a kingdom turn. Once per turn at level 1, twice per turn at level 4 and 3 times per turn at level 9. Claiming hexes does award kingdom experience points, as we've talked about before. All right, establish settlement. So you've reconnoitered a hex, you've cleared a hex, you've claimed a hex. Now I want to put a town there. You establish a settlement. This also has the region trait. You attempt to set up a new village in a hex. Requirement, the hex has been cleared using the clear hex activity. Requirement, the hex does not contain a settlement. And yes, freeholds count as settlements. Skill check. You can roll engineering, industry, politics, or scholarship. And the resource point cost varies based on your degree of success. If you critically succeed, you establish the settlement with the aid of eager volunteers and spend 1d6 resource points. If you succeed, it's the same thing. You establish the settlement, but you spend more, 3d6 RP. Failure, you do manage to establish a settlement. However, it costs you 6d6 RP, and only if you critically fail do you not establish the settlement. Establish trade agreement. All right, this one is a little weird at first. I'm going to read through it. It's not super useful at first until you do the manage trade agreements activity, but we'll get to that later. So establish trade agreement. This has the leadership trait. This is where you set up an economic compact with a group in the stolen lands. Requirement, you must have established a diplomatic relationship with the group in question. I don't think I've talked about that one yet. Yeah, we'll get to that one later. See the send diplomatic envoy activity. The skill check for this is trade, and if the group is connected to the kingdom via water, it can be boating. And if the kingdom has master proficiency in magic, then you can use magic, presumably because you can send communications via magic. The DC is the higher of the group's negotiation DC, which the GM has access to, or the kingdom's control DC. If you critically succeed at this check, you have established trade agreements. You roll 2 resource dice and gain that many resource points. If you succeed, well, you've established trade agreements. Awesome. If you fail, you still establish the trade agreements. However, you have to roll 2 resource dice and pay that many resource points. And if you don't pay, then excuse me. Then the attempt to establish trade agreements just fails. You don't establish them. And then if you critically fail, the trade agreements are not established and the traders that you sent out never return. You gain 1 unrest and take a -1 penalty to all economy-based checks until the end of the next kingdom turn. Focused attention. This is an activity with the leadership trait. This is similar to the aid action. This is a leader attempting to aid another leader in a future check. What skill check are you rolling? Well, it varies by a chosen skill that you're trying to help with. So you choose a leader and a kingdom skill. You attempt a DC 15 check with the chosen skill. If you succeed, you give the chosen leader a +2 circumstance bonus on a kingdom check using the chosen skill in this kingdom turn. Focused attention only ever takes a single action, and critically failing the check for this activity never increases unrest or ruin. New leadership. This is an upkeep. This has the upkeep trait. We never really talked about that one. It just means it happens during the upkeep phase. This is an attempt to promote a new character into a leadership role within the kingdom. The skill checks associated with this are intrigue, politics, statecraft, or warfare. You gain a +2 circumstance bonus for each skill used to promote specific leadership roles. If you're rolling intrigue, you get a bonus if you're appointing the emissary or treasurer. For politics, it's if you're appointing the counselor or ruler. If you roll statecraft, to appoint the magister or envoy, and warfare for the general or warden. You take a -4 circumstance penalty to appoint a ruler. That one's bad. You also gain 1 unrest unless the check is a crit success if you're appointing a ruler. So don't lose your ruler. If you critically succeed, the leader is accepted. The leader gains a +1 circumstance bonus to all kingdom skill checks until the end of the next turn. Success, the leader fills the role, nothing happens. Failure. The leader does fill the leadership role. However, they take a -1 circumstance penalty to all checks made during the activity phase. To remove this penalty, the leader must succeed at any loyalty-based skill check on the next kingdom turn. Yeah, so this is persistent, which sucks. If you critically fail, the leadership role is treated as vacant. The new leadership activity must be attempted again on the next kingdom turn, and unrest increases by 1. Pledge of Fealty. This has the leadership trait. You offer citizenship to independent groups. The skill check for this is Intrigue, Statecraft, or Warfare, and certain skills will be more effective on some groups and less effective on others. The DC is equal to the negotiation DC for the group that you're targeting with the activity, and the GM knows what that DC is. If you critically succeed, the group joins the kingdom. They grant a boon listed for the GM, so you get some benefit that the GM knows based on what group it is. And then the hex that group is in is immediately claimed successfully. Hooray! You also gain 10 kingdom experience. As a success, the group does join the kingdom, but you have to pay them for their integration. So you roll 1 resource die and pay the resulting RP. And the hex is not immediate. The hex that they're in is not immediately claimed. You then have to claim the hex in the future. If you fail, the group doesn't join the kingdom. If you critically fail, the group violently rejects your offer. You increase unrest by 2. You increase a ruin of your choice by 1. And then that group cannot be incorporated later unless the GM gives approval. All right, Quell Unrest. This has the leadership trait. You suppress dissent and unrest among the citizenry. You can do this with a lot of different stuff. So arts, folklore, intrigue, magic, politics, or warfare. I've said it many times, flavor is free. You can describe what you're doing here with this particular skill in order to make this make sense within the context of your kingdom. If you critically succeed, you reduce unrest by 1d6. If you succeed, you reduce unrest by 1. If you fail, you don't reduce unrest, and if you critically fail, your agents cause further dissatisfaction. Either increase unrest by 1d4, or increase 2 ruins of your choosing by 1 each. As a special rule, this activity is limited to once per turn. Repair Reputation. This has the leadership trait. You attempt to reduce your ruin scores. The skill check you try to roll depends on which ruin you're trying to reduce. So if you're trying to reduce corruption, you roll an arts check. Crime, a trade check. Decay, an engineering check. Strife, an intrigue check. And you must be trained in the skill if you're going to try to use it to repair reputation. If you critically succeed, you reduce the target ruin by 2. If you succeed, you reduce the target ruin by 1. If you fail, you do not reduce the target ruin. However, and you cannot attempt to repair reputation on this ruin until the next kingdom turn. So you can't just repair it, fail, and then try to repair it again. You have to wait. Critically fail, you increase the unrest by 1d4. That's steep. And you cannot attempt to repair reputation on this ruin for 3 kingdom turns. That's bad. Rest and relax. This has the leadership trait. Leaders and citizens alike relax and recuperate. The skill checks associated with this are arts, boating, scholarship, trade, or wilderness. The DC increases by 4 if you have taken this activity on the previous kingdom turn. You can only rest and relax so much. If you critically succeed, you reduce unrest by 1. Nice. And you gain a +2 circumstance bonus on your next leadership activity. If you succeed, you reduce unrest by 1. If you fail, you don't reduce unrest. And if you critically fail, you don't reduce unrest and take a -2 circumstance penalty to the next leadership activity. Retrain. This is a new one from Vance and Kerenshara. You attempt to retrain a kingdom feat, skill increase, or specialized skill choice. The limitations here are consistent with PC retraining. So if you're familiar with how PCs retrain, and you can't retrain something that's a prerequisite for something else, it's the same thing here. So the limitations are basically the same. You can only retrain once per turn, and the skill check depends on what you're trying to retrain. If you're trying to retrain a kingdom feat, you have to roll politics. If you're trying to retrain a skill increase, you roll politics or the skill to be increased. A kingdom can't become untrained in a skill, so you can't get yourself out of trained. It's not going to happen. Additionally, a skill cannot be reduced below the prerequisite requirements for feats or structures that the kingdom has. If you retrain a specialized skill, then the check that you're rolling is that skill. If you critically succeed, you succeed in retraining that choice. You spend 1 resource point for a feat or for a skill increase. If you succeed, the retraining succeeds still, but you spend 1 resource die. You roll it and then spend the resulting RP. Again, applies to feats or skill increases. And then you spend 1 RP if it's a specialized skill. If it's a failure, the retraining doesn't succeed. You still roll a resource die and spend the RP for feats or skill increases, and spend 1 RP for a specialized skill. And if it's a critical fail, you roll 2 resource dice for a skill increase or a kingdom feat, and 1 resource die for a specialized skill. On top of that, if you critically fail, you can't retrain on the next kingdom turn. Take charge. This is a leadership activity. You attempt to gain additional resources by taking charge of specific activities. What's the skill check? It's any trained kingdom skill. If you critically succeed, you gain a resource point. Additionally, you gain a +1 circumstance bonus to the next check the leader makes with that chosen skill. If you roll a success, you gain a resource point. A failure, you don't gain a resource point. And critically fail, you don't gain a resource point, and you take a -1 circumstance penalty to the next check the leader makes with the chosen skill. Special rule, the same skill check can never be used to take charge more than once in the same kingdom turn. So this is a way that you can generate small numbers of resource points. Establish farmland. This has the region trait. You are trying to set up a farm, which will then offset consumption. The requirements: you must have a hex that has either plains or hills as the predominant terrain feature. That hex must be within the influence of 1 or more settlements. The skill check you're rolling is agriculture, so we are officially in the skill-specific activities. The RP cost and the DC varies by terrain. If it's in plains, it costs 1 resource point and it's equal to your control DC. If it's in the hills, you spend 2 resource points and the control DC, or you add 5 to the control DC. That +5 can make these checks really hard. This is a great candidate for any ability you get later that lets you do like a reroll. Supernatural Solution in specific, which we'll talk about later. But yeah, establishing farmland on hills is very tricky, especially early on. If you critically succeed, you establish the farmland in the target hex as well as in an adjacent hex, assuming there's an adjacent hex that qualifies. If the first hex was in the hills, then the adjacent hex can be hills or plains. If the target hex was plains, then the adjacent hex must be plains. If no appropriate hex is available, then this bonus farmland doesn't happen. If you succeed, you establish the farmland. If you fail, you don't establish it, and if you critically fail, not only do you not establish it, for the next 2 event phases, you attempt a DC 6 flat check. And if you fail, you trigger a crop failure event, which is really bad. Next activity, harvest crops. You gather food commodities from the wilderness or from farmland. The skill check for this is agriculture. If you critically succeed, you gain 1d4 food commodities. If you succeed, you gain 1. If you fail, you don't gain any. And if you critically fail, you lose 1d4 food commodities. If you have no food to lose, you gain 1 unrest. And this is where I'm just brief reminder, food is never passively generated. It always takes actions to acquire. This is one of those actions. Craft luxuries. This is a leadership activity. You encourage artists to produce a batch of luxury goods. The resource point cost is equal to rolling a... what is the resource point cost? You roll an RD, or a resource die, and you pay the result. If you don't pay it, it results in an automatic failure. The skill check for this is arts. If you critically succeed, you gain 1d4 luxury commodities. If you succeed, you gain 1 luxury commodity. If you fail, you don't gain any. And if you critically fail, you don't gain any, and you increase a ruin of your choice by 1. This is taking way longer to read than I thought it would. Create a masterpiece. This is a leadership activity. You encourage artists to create masterful works to improve the reputation of the kingdom. The skill check for this is arts. If you critically succeed, you gain 1 renown, and you roll 2 resource dice and gain the resulting RP. You also gain 1 renown at the beginning of the next kingdom turn. So that's really good. If you succeed, you just gain the 1 renown. If you fail, you don't gain any renown. And if you critically fail, you lose a renown. And if you don't have any to lose, you gain 1d4 unrest. If you creating a masterpiece can only be attempted once per kingdom turn. Go fishing. I'm from Minnesota. This is my favorite of the kingdom activities. You harvest fish from local water sources like rivers or lakes. The requirement is that you have to have at least 1 claimed hex, which contains a river or a lake terrain type. The skill check for this is boating. If you critically succeed, you gain 1d4 food commodities. If you succeed, you gain 1. If you fail, you don't gain any. And if you critically fail, the fisher folk are lost to a disaster, and you gain 1 unrest. Fortify hex. This has the region trait. You construct a defensive fortification within an otherwise unfortified area. Now, the requirement is that the target hex must be claimed and must not contain a settlement. The resource point cost varies by the worst terrain feature in that hex. So if hexes can contain multiple terrain features, you pick the worst one among this list, and that's what it costs. If its worst terrain feature is mountains, you pay 12. If it's swamps, you pay 8. If it's forests, you pay 4. If it's hills, you pay 2. And if it's plains, you pay 1. The skill check for this is defense. If you critically succeed, the hex becomes fortified. You recover half of the RP that you spent on it, and you reduce unrest by 1. If you succeed, the hex becomes fortified and you reduce unrest by 1. You don't recover any of the RP. If you fail, the hex is not fortified, and if you critically fail, not only is it not fortified, you gain 1 unrest due to lost or injured workers. The benefits of a fortified hex are that you give that hex the refuge feature. I talked about that in part 2. Settlements later established on this site may incorporate the refuge into a barracks or similar structure at a reduced cost. However, this is up to the GM's discretion. Provide care. This is a leadership activity. You provide direct aid to healers and medical workers to help the citizenry. The skill check for this is defense. If you critically succeed, you reduce unrest by 1 and reduce a ruin of your choice by 1. If you succeed, you simply reduce unrest by 1. If you fail, you do not reduce unrest at all, and if you critically fail, you increase unrest or a ruin of your choice by 1. Build roads. This has the region trait. You construct roadways and thoroughfares to aid in travel, trade, and defense. Roads reduce the difficulty of traveling through terrain. As an example, roads through a forest allow travelers to pass through it as though it were open terrain. Requirement: the target hex must be claimed. You must have claimed it at some point. The RP cost, again, varies by worst terrain feature. Mountains 12, swamps 8, forests 4, hills 2, and plains 1. The skill check for this is engineering. If you critically succeed, you build roads in the target hex and 1 hex adjacent to it, which contains terrain of the same or lesser hostility. If you succeed, you build the roads in the target hex. If you fail, the roads are not built, and if you critically fail, not only are the roads not built, but unrest increases by 1 due to lost or injured workers. The demolish activity. This has the civic trait, meaning it is settlement specific. You attempt to clear an occupied lot in a settlement. Multi-lot structures require multiple demolish activities. We'll get into part 4 for how lots work, or we'll get into how lots work in part 4. The skill check for this is engineering. If you critically succeed, you get to choose one of the following 2 benefits. You demolish an entire multi-lot structure and clear all the lots it occupies. Or you recover 1d6 commodities from the rubble of a single lot action. So if you're trying to demolish a multi-lot structure, you clear it. If you're trying to demolish a single lot structure, you recover 1d6 commodities from the rubble of a single lot action. These commodities are limited to lumber, stone, and ore. You can't recover food or luxuries. That doesn't make sense. If you succeed, you demolish a single lot successfully. If you fail, the structure is removed, but the rubble remains on the lot and must be demolished again to clear it. If you critically fail, this is like a failure, but the worksite injuries cause unrest to increase by 1. Establish worksite. This has the region trait. You set up a commodity harvesting site. The target hex must contain some relevant terrain features for the specified commodity. Lumber camps need forests, mines and quarries require hills or mountains. The RP cost, again, varies by the worst terrain feature: mountains 12, swamps 8, forests 4, hills 2, or plains 1. The skill check for this is engineering. If you critically succeed, the worksite is established. Commodity yields are doubled for this hex until the end of the next kingdom turn. If you succeed, the worksite is established. If you fail, it is not established, and if you critically fail, the worksite is not established, but unrest increases by 1 due to lost or injured workers. You're probably starting to see a trend with the critical failures. Irrigation. This activity has the region trait. You construct artificial water features, such as dams, canals, and drainage systems, or using dams, canals, and drainage systems. The target hex must be adjacent to a river or lake, but must not contain one of those features. This is important. So ultimately, this activity is allowing you to put a lake or river in a hex that doesn't otherwise contain it. This is a really good way to move a water feature close to an existing settlement to allow that settlement to construct a pier or a waterfront when it otherwise wouldn't be able to. Pretty useful. Piers and waterfronts are structures. We'll talk about them in part 4. The RP cost, again, varies by the worst terrain feature: mountains 12, swamps 8, forests 4, hills 2, and plains 1. The skill check for this is engineering, but you must be at least trained in order to roll it. If you critically succeed, the target hex gains a river or a lake. The placement is up to the players and the GMs together, and additionally, because it's a critical success, you recover half of the RP that you spent on this activity. If you succeed, it's like a crit success, but you don't regain the RP, so you still get to place the river or lake. If you fail, the target hex does not gain a river or a lake. If you critically fail, the target hex does not gain a river or a lake. Additionally, unrest increases by 1, and from now on, you attempt a DC 4 flat check every turn. If you fail, you get the Plague Kingdom event. That's a bad one. In order to remove this check, you have to run irrigation on this hex again. You have to do this activity again and succeed. Hire adventurers. This has the leadership trait. This is you attempting to hire adventurers to deal with an ongoing kingdom event for you. The resource point cost is you roll a resource die and you spend the resulting RP. The DC is equal to the event DC for the chosen event. The skill check for this is exploration. If you critically succeed, the adventurers end the continuous event. If you succeed, the adventurers gain a +2 circumstance bonus, or the adventurers give you a +2 circumstance bonus to checks to end the event in the next event phase. If you fail, the event is not ended, and you have to spend an additional 2 resource dice to hire adventurers again for this event. If you critically fail, it's as a failure, so the event is not ended. However, no adventurers can be hired to resolve the target kingdom event. You can't hire adventurers to deal with this problem for you again. Blessed Solution. This is a new one from V&K. You attempt to enlist the aid of divine or spiritual beings. There's a limit on this. We're going to run into a couple activities that have the fortune trait. These allow for things like rerolls. Blessed Solution, Supernatural Solution, Creative Solution. that's some of the, I think that's all of them. You can only ever use one of those to help a kingdom activity. You can't stack them. So we haven't talked about it yet, but we can't use a blessed solution and a supernatural solution both to help a specific kingdom activity. It's not allowed. How do you do this? You choose a kingdom skill activity. If you chose a build structure, you also specify the structure that you're choosing. What are you doing here? You're trying to allow a reroll. So you roll a folklore check. And if you critically succeed, you gain a +2 status bonus to the skill check that you chose. Or excuse me, I'm going to back up. You're not choosing a skill check. You're choosing a kingdom activity. So you would choose, for instance, hire adventurers. If I'm just going to use the previous one, you say, all right, I'm attempting blessed solution. I'm choosing hire adventurers. So the next time I hire adventurers, I want to do a benefit, or I want to gain the benefit of blessed solution. I then roll a folklore check against my control DC. If I critically succeed, then I gain a +2 status bonus to the activity I chose. So in this case, hire adventurers. I gain a +2 status bonus to hire adventurers on this kingdom turn. I may choose to re-roll that check using folklore with no bonus and a -2 penalty. So I get a +2. If I don't like my result, I can then say, okay, I want to roll folklore and take a -2 penalty. Then I can choose either result. I then gain it. Okay, that's great. If I don't use this, I just gain 10 experience points. Like I pick, uh, I pick hire adventurers. I roll my initial hire adventurers check. It works great. I don't have to use this reroll. Great. I just get 10 experience points if I don't use that by the end of the kingdom turn. Cool. All right. What happens if I succeed? Okay. The cool thing about this one is if you succeed, it's the same as a critical success. However, you have to pay 1d4 resource points. Not that bad. If you fail, the reroll doesn't happen. You can't do it. You don't gain the status bonus. And you have to pay 2d6 RP in offerings, and you don't get any benefit. So that one sucks. If you critically fail, not only do you pay the 2d6 in offerings and get no benefit, but now you have angered the spirits, and Blessed Solution cannot be attempted for 2 kingdom turns. So I kind of fumbled my way through that, but basically you pick an action that you want to do, and you say, all right, I want to try to get a reroll on this future check. You roll your folklore check. Great. I know that I have a reroll banked, or dang it, I didn't get it. Either way, you then get to the check that you designated. You roll it first with a bonus, and you either are happy with the result of that original roll, in which case you don't apply the reroll and you gain 10 XP, or you're not happy. You apply the reroll using folklore, and then you get to choose which result you want. Observe customs. This is a leadership activity. Again, it's folklore. The attempt here is to coordinate religious and superstitious blessings and sanctifications of a kingdom. You're trying to get all the blessings and superstitious activities together to help the kingdom out. You roll a folklore check. If you critically succeed, you gain a +2 circumstance bonus to all stability-based checks for this kingdom turn. If you succeed, it's very similar, but it's a +1 bonus. If you fail, you gain a +1 circumstance bonus to stability-based kingdom checks. However, you reduce the resource dice that you roll on the next kingdom turn by 1. If you critically fail, you get no bonus, you gain 1 unrest, you gain a ruin of your choice, or you increase a ruin of your choice by 1, and you still reduce the resource die on the next kingdom turn by 1. Relocate capital. You're attempting to move the capital from one settlement to another. The target settlement, which is not your capital, must contain a palace, a castle, or a town hall. All leaders must spend 2 leadership activities to perform this activity. The skill check for this is industry, and you must be trained in it. and the DC of this check is equal to your control DC plus 5. This activity has a 3 kingdom turn cooldown, meaning if you do it, you can't do it again for 3 kingdom turns. After this activity, leaders may only attempt activities with the civic, commerce, or region traits. If you critically succeed on your check, the capital is successfully moved. If you regular succeed, it's as a crit success, but you increase unrest by 1. If you fail, it's as a success, but you also increased 2 ruins of your choice by 1, so that sucks. If you critically fail, the capital doesn't move, you gain 1d4 unrest, and you increase 3 ruins by 1 and 1 ruin by 3. Do not fail this activity. You have to have a really good reason to want to move your capital, because there's no benefit in this activity on its own, and there's only negatives. So most people will not use this very often. Infiltration. This has the leadership trait. You send out spies and informants to collect information on a target group. The skill check for this is Intrigue. If you critically succeed, the GM provides exact and precise information about the target. If your own kingdom is the target, which you can do, you reduce unrest by 1d4, or you reduce 1 ruin by 1. So it's very useful to target your own citizens with this. If you succeed, the GM shares imprecise but still useful information, and if you were targeting your own kingdom, you reduce unrest by 1. If you fail, no useful information is gathered, and if you critically fail, your spies are captured, and you take a -2 circumstance penalty on all kingdom checks until the end of the kingdom turn. Clandestine business. You're attempting to exploit criminal elements to recover resource points and commodities in exchange for protection. Your skill check for this is Intrigue, and you must be trained in order to attempt it. The DC of this increases over time. At first, it's your control DC. However, it increases by 2 for every turn you take this action after the first. It decreases by 1 for every turn you don't take the action, down to a minimum value of the control DC. So, I attempt this for the very first time, the DC is the control DC. On the next turn, I attempt it again. Okay, now it's my control DC plus 2. I attempt it again on turn 3. Now it's my control DC plus 4, because I've attempted it 2 turns in a row. I guess now 3 turns in a row. Then I don't attempt it. Okay, it goes down by 1. Now it's 13. Not 13, plus 3. I don't attempt it for 3 more turns. It's back down to the control DC, but it never drops below that. If you critically succeed on this, you roll a resource die and gain the resulting resource points, or you gain 1d4 luxury commodities. If you succeed, you gain all those benefits. However, you increase unrest by 1 because rumors of your political impropriety have spread among the populace. If you fail, you roll 1 resource die and gain the resulting resource points. You don't have the option for the luxuries, and you increase unrest by 1 and corruption by 1. Corruption is one of your ruins. If you critically fail, you don't gain any resources or commodities, or resource points or commodities. You increase unrest by 1d6, you increase corruption by 2, and you increase any other ruin by 1. Any ruin of your choosing by 1. Supernatural solution. I've mentioned this a few times. Take a sip of my water. This one's important. This functions like aid, kind of. The number bonus you give isn't the same thing, but you can kind of think of it like aiding with the magic skill. What you're trying to do is to allow a reroll on a check as it is about to be made. The skill check for this is magic. The DC is equal to the DC of the chosen kingdom skill check. So the way this happens is the ruler, it doesn't have to be the ruler. I'm listing these leadership roles as an example. The ruler says, I am going to undertake the go fishing activity. And for some reason, the envoy thinks we really need to succeed on go fishing. The envoy then says, I am going to attempt supernatural solution. They take that action before the ruler resolves go fishing. That's the order of events. You roll a magic check against the DC of, in this case of the example, go fishing. If you critically succeed, you essentially get to roll the check twice. All right, hang on. Back up just a second. You don't. Okay, you roll magic against that DC, that skill. I didn't explain this super well. All right, you attempt to go fishing. You do your supernatural solution on that. You roll your magic check, and you either succeed, critically succeed, fail, or critically fail. What happens? Okay, I critically succeeded on my original check. Now I get to essentially roll the magic, or roll the go fishing check twice. The ruler rolls it, and then I roll it, and I use magic instead of their like go fishing. I think boating. Their boating check. You then get, if you critically succeeded on your original, then you get to keep the better of the two results. If you succeeded on the original, you also keep the better of the two results, but you pay 1d4 resource points in order to do it. If you fail, you pay 2d6 resource points and you gain no benefit. And if you critically fail, not only do you gain no benefit and have to pay the 2d6 resource points, you also cannot attempt supernatural solution again for 2 kingdom turns. You can only have, this has the fortune trait, and you can only have supernatural solution, blessed solution, or creative solution overlapping, or you can't overlap them. You can't apply more than one fortune trait activity to a roll. It doesn't work that way. All right, all of that got a little muddled, but essentially you get to roll. If you succeed on your initial magic check, then you get to roll an activity twice and keep the better one. That keeping the better result is extremely rare. A lot of things will say, oh, you have to keep the second one. This is the only roll in the game that lets you reroll in the like kingdom building mechanics that lets you keep the better one, meaning supernatural solution is probably the best, most powerful activity in the game. You're probably going to roll this more than any other check, or it's going to be more important than any other single check that you roll. The practical magic feat we talked about in video number 2 in this series, that makes this feat better, or that makes this activity better. So getting practical magic early, either taking it as your level 7 feat or being a thumocracy, which gives it to you automatically at level 1, can make this really strong. The same goes for prognostication. This is another leadership activity, and you're attempting to read omens and other signs to guide the kingdom through future events. This is another magic check, and you are required to be trained in magic in order to attempt it. You roll your magic check. If you critically succeed, if there's a random kingdom event on this kingdom turn, you roll twice, and the PCs choose which event they want to face. They also gain a +2 circumstance bonus against the event. If you succeed, you gain a +1 circumstance bonus to all checks made to resolve an event this turn. This is pretty good. If you fail, the omens don't tell you anything, nothing happens. If you critically fail, the readings are woefully inaccurate. So not only do you not know what random kingdom event is going to happen, you're guaranteed to face one this turn, and you roll twice, and the GM decides which one to throw at the players. This is another really good activity. It sounds like it's not super great, but being able to pick which random kingdom event impacts the kingdom on a given turn is extremely useful. Practical magic also, the feat practical magic also helps with this. So this is 2 magic activities that are both very powerful and can both be impacted by practical magic. Again, take it at level 7 or 6 or whatever the prereq for that is, or be a thumocracy and get it at level 1. It's very, very good. Improve lifestyle. This has the leadership trait. You attempt to use funds in the treasury to improve life for the citizenry. Your skill check for this is politics. If you critically succeed, you gain a +2 circumstance bonus on all culture-based checks for the rest of the kingdom turn. If you succeed, it's like a crit success, but it's a +1 bonus instead. If you fail, um, you still get, this one's kind of fun. If you fail, you still get the bonus, a +1 bonus to culture-based checks, but you then take a -1 penalty to economy-based checks for the rest of the kingdom turn. I like that one. That one's cool. And then if you critically fail, you take the -1 circumstance penalty to economy-based checks for the rest of the kingdom turn. You don't get a +1 bonus to culture checks. Then you increase unrest by 1. Then you increase a ruin by 1. The ruin is of your choosing. Ouch. That one's bad. Tap treasury. This is a leadership activity. You attempt to use funds from the treasury to pay for the needs of the PCs or for a kingdom event. An event can trigger, there are certain kingdom events that will trigger the tap treasury activity. They will tell you when this happens. It's pretty clear. Otherwise, you use it to try to pay for stuff that the PCs need. The skill check for this is politics. The DC is equal to the control. I don't know why I wrote that down. It's always equal to the control DC unless I say otherwise. There's a special rule for this. Once the tap treasury action succeeds or critically succeeds, the degrees of success for this activity are reduced by 2 for all future tap treasury attempts. This is removed. So basically, you've siphoned the funds out of the treasury. You can no longer succeed or critically succeed after that until equivalent funds have been restored to the treasury via the capital investment activity, which we'll talk about next. If you critically succeed at tap treasury, the funds are withdrawn equal to the currency per additional PC column of the party treasure by level table on page 59 of the GM core. If that doesn't mean anything to you, basically when you add a P, like let's say you have a 4-man party and you add a 5th man into the party later in the game after people have leveled up, the page 59 of the GM core tells you how much gold that person gets. That's the amount of gold you can withdraw from the treasury in this. So page 59 of the GM core, that's what that means. Alternatively, if you critically succeed, the triggering event is funded. That's if an event forced you to use this activity. If you regular succeed instead of critically succeeding, you pull the funds out, but you take a -1 circumstance penalty on all economy-based checks until the end of the next kingdom turn. So just like a critical success, but you take a penalty. Failure. No funding is secured. You also take a -1 circumstance penalty on all loyalty and economy-based checks until the end of the kingdom turn. Critical fail. As a failure, so -1 circumstance penalty to loyalty and economy-based checks until the end of the kingdom turn, but also increase unrest by 1 and increase ruin by 1, or 1 ruin of your choosing by 1. Creative solution. This has the leadership activity. You attempt to aid a check with scholarship, allowing a reroll after a roll is attempted. This is a scholarship activity. The DC of this activity is equal to the DC of the chosen kingdom skill check. If you critically succeed, you re-roll the chosen check at a +2 circumstance bonus and must take the new result. If you succeed, it's as a critical success, so you re-roll at a +2 and must take the new, but you pay 1d4 resource points. If you fail, you must pay 2d6 resource points, but you gain no benefit. And if you critically fail, you take a -1. Not only do you pay the 2d6 resource points, and not only do you gain no benefit, but you also take a -1 circumstance penalty to all culture-based checks until the end of the next kingdom turn. Only one fortune trait activity can benefit a kingdom activity at a given time. Again, Blessed Solution, Supernatural Solution, and Creative Solution cannot be used in conjunction with each other to benefit specific kingdom activities. So, what's the turn order for this look like? The ruler decides to go fishing. Getting back to my go fishing activity. They roll a go fishing check. All right, cool. They don't like their result. The envoy decides, no, we actually need to we need to succeed on this go fishing check. They roll a scholarship check against the DC of the go fishing check. If they critically succeed, then the go fishing check can be re-rolled, and the original check can be re-rolled. So you roll go fishing again, and this time you take a +2 circumstance bonus. You have to take the second result. That's pretty straightforward. And then if you succeed, you have to pay 1d4 RP. If you fail, you don't gain the benefits of the reroll, but you still have to pay. And then if you critically fail, it's the stuff I talked about a minute ago. All right, request foreign aid. This is a leadership activity. You call out to other nations for help. You have to have established diplomatic relations with the group that you're talking about, or that you're trying to request help from. The skill check for this is statecraft, and you have to be trained in order to do it. The DC is equal to the negotiation DC for the group +2, and the GM knows what that number is. If you've requested on a previous turn, like the previous turn, then that DC increases by 2 and then goes down by 1 for every turn that you don't request, back down to that original DC. If you critically succeed, you gain a +4 circumstance bonus on any one kingdom skill check this turn. You get to choose which one you apply it to. Additionally, you roll 2 resource dice and gain the resulting resource points. This represents the help that they sent, that the target group sent to the kingdom. If you succeed, then either roll 1 resource die and collect the resultant resource points, or gain a +2 circumstance bonus on any one kingdom skill check this turn. If you fail, you gain 1d4 RP at the start of the next kingdom turn. They did send help, but it came late. If you critically fail, no aid is received, and you increase unrest by 1d4. Send diplomatic envoy. You attempt to send emissaries to attempt to improve relations with another group. The skill check for this is statecraft, and you must be trained in order to attempt it. The DC is equal to the DC is equal to the negotiation DC of the target group. And as a special rule, you take a -4 circumstance penalty to this check if that group is actively at war with the kingdom. If you critically succeed, you establish diplomatic relations with the group. On its own, that doesn't sound like much. However, it is, as we've talked about with a few other activities, you need to have diplomatic relations with a group before you can do other stuff, like establish trade agreements or, on the previous activity, request foreign aid from them. In addition, on a critical success, you gain a +2 circumstance bonus on all checks with that group for the rest of the kingdom turn. So that part's really nice. If you succeed, you just establish the diplomatic relations, and there's no bonus on further checks with that group. On a failure, no relations are established. However, you do gain a +2 circumstance bonus on this same activity on the same group on the next kingdom turn. So, failure, yeah, it didn't work out this turn, but if you try again on the next turn with the same group, you get a +2 bonus to the check to make that happen. If you critically fail, not only are relationships not established, they can't be established with this group for 3 turns. Additionally, choose one from the following list. You increase unrest by 1d4, or increase 1 ruin by 1, or roll 2 resource dice and spend the result. Ouch. Capital investment. This is a leadership activity. The PCs give funds to the treasury. This can be loot. It doesn't just have to be gold. So objects of monetary value, not just coins. If this action is taken to repay funds from the tap treasury activity, then you don't actually need to roll, and the funds are just paid back in with no benefits. If you try to use this activity to generate resource points, a thing you can do, then the investment that you need to put in is equal to the currency per additional PC column of the party treasure by level table of page 59 of the GM core. So again, that thing I talked about earlier where the amount of money you would give a PC if they added the group at a certain level, that's the amount you would have to pay in order to use this activity to generate resource points. Also, forgot to mention this earlier, that table is printed in V&K's rules PDF, again, linked in the description of this video. The skill check for this is trade. If you critically succeed on the check, you roll 4 resource dice and gain the resulting resource points. Additionally, you can do that, or you gain the additional 4 resource dice on the next kingdom turn. So you critically succeed, you either gain the RP from 4 resource dice now, or you add 4 resource dice as bonus dice on the beginning of your next kingdom turn. Both are pretty good. If you succeed, it's as a critical success, so you get the choice, but it's 2 resource dice instead of 4. If you fail, you gain 1d4 resource points. If you critically fail, then either you roll 1 resource die and increase RP and crime by the result, or you increase RP by 0 and crime by 1. This is potentially okay, but it's dangerous, because if your resource die is really big and you roll it, you can gain resource points, but you can also increase crime by a really big number really quickly. And reducing ruin in general is not the easiest thing in the world to do. Manage trade agreements. So if you have trade agreements, this is sending out agents to actively trade goods through those established channels. In order to do this, you must have at least 1 established trade agreement with another group within the Stolen Lands. This costs 2 resource points per trade agreement that you're attempting to manage, and there is a limit on how many you can manage with this activity. It's 2 plus 2 per your proficiency rank in trade. So if you're untrained, it's 2. If you're trained, it's 4. If you're expert, it's 6. If you're master, it's 8. And if you're legendary, it's 10. You can manage a lot of trade agreements, but you have to have a number of trade agreements established in order to manage that many. The DC is equal to your control DC. However, it increases by 5 if this activity was taken on a previous kingdom turn. The previous kingdom turn. If you critically succeed on your check, then at the start of the next kingdom turn, you gain the following: 1 bonus resource die per managed agreement and 1 commodity per managed agreement. However, the number of luxuries you can gain is limited by half. So if you gain 2 commodities, only 1 of them can be luxuries. If it's a success as opposed to a critical success, you choose between the resource die per managed agreement or the commodities per managed agreement. If it's a failure, you gain 1 resource point per trade agreement at the start of the next kingdom turn. Resource point, not resource die rolls. And then if you critically fail, you gain no RP or commodities, and you cannot undertake this activity again for 1 kingdom turn. Please note, commodities on this one can include food. So this is one way to generate food. The purchase commodities activity has the leadership trait. You spend resource points in order to gain commodities. This is a trade check, and the RP cost is dependent on what commodities you're trying to get. You pay 4 resource points for food or stone or lumber, and 8 resource points for luxuries. If you critically succeed, you gain 4 commodities of the chosen type and 2 commodities of any other type, except luxuries. If you succeed, you gain 2 commodities of the chosen type. If you fail, you gain 1 commodity of the chosen type. And if you critically fail, you gain no commodities. Collect taxes. This is a leadership activity. You attempt to gather funds from the citizens. The skill check for this is trade, and you must be trained in order to perform it. If you critically succeed, you gain a +2 circumstance bonus on economy-based checks for the rest of the kingdom turn. If you simply succeed rather than critically succeed, it's a +1 bonus. If, however, taxes were collected on the previous turn, you then increase unrest by 1. A failure is just like a success. However, You automatically increase unrest by 1, regardless of whether taxes were collected. And if taxes were collected, you increase it by 2 instead of 1. If you critically fail, you gain no bonus. So no bonus on economy-based checks. You automatically increase unrest by 2, and you increase any ruin of your choosing by 1. Gather livestock. This is a leadership activity. You collect excess livestock from the wilderness and from local farms. The skill check for this is wilderness. If you critically succeed, you gain 1d4 food commodities. If you succeed, you gain 1 food commodity. If you fail, you gain no food commodities. If you critically fail, you lose 1d4 food commodities. And if you have no food to lose, you increase unrest by 1. And that is the last kingdom activity. We did it. We did every single one. That was a lot. I'm not super thrilled with how I covered the fortune trait activities, so I think I'm going to go back and probably re-record those and probably script out examples for those in the beginning of the next video, because I'm not super happy with how that turned out. But overall, what we covered in this video was the kingdom turn, which I think is fairly straightforward. You just got to kind of practice it. And then the individual kingdom activities. Part 4 is where we're going to start getting into some real nuts and bolts type stuff. We're going to start getting into settlements. We talked a lot about building structures. That's a mini game within a mini game here. The kingdom activities are a lot of what you're going to be doing. However, getting into the minutia of settlement building is that if you thought this one went on for a while, settlement building is going to take a long time. So thank you all for joining me. I hope you enjoyed going through these rules, or at the very least found it useful. Like I said, I think I'm going to redo those fortune trait examples because they get a little clunky. I think I'm going to script those out because I wasn't super happy with that. So check back in a week. That'll probably be on my corrections and clarifications section at the beginning of the next video. So thank you all for your time, and I will see you next time.